times. We had the Epik hack, which is a fairly unique bit of hacktivism. We've had the TwitchBreach, which I don't know, I think it's boring. There's been a bunch of stuff going on with Kape Technology taking over VPNs, Zerodium looking for VPN ODAs, and Alperovitch has started an institute. So he was actually invited before we knew that that was happening. So like that's not why he's here. However, it happens to be fortuitous. So who wants to get us going on any of these topics?
I kind of want to start by just pestering Dmitri with questions. And
let's do that. Yeah.
The thing that I know about Dmitri
making sure
is
he never makes a mistake of coming back to this call.
Is waterboarding involved in that?
There will be no waterboarding, or I don't even know what we called it originally. Extra special
enhanced interrogation tactics.
There will be none of that. I have no desire to lead a national security organ of any kind. That's apparently what that gets you. So I have a lot of questions, but I think, like, you know, I went to the fancy soiree last week. It was amazing. It was honestly one of the most impressive shows of force I've seen in a long time when it comes to cyber policy. And, you know, I have not seen the head of the Department of Homeland Security give a customized, personalized speech at an event in a long time. Usually the speeches are generic, they are boring, they have nothing to do with the event. But
sorry,
what
is
I
there
saw,
a question in here, or like?
Yes, there's a question.
The question is, statement.
No, there's a question. And the question is, where are you taking it? Where is the institute going? What is the, like, if you have to like drive toward a goal, what's the goal?
Yeah. So thanks for coming out. It was a great event. That's how we roll here at the Alperovitch Institute. So first of all, I have to say that one of the things I'm most excited about is that the amazing Thomas Red will be the director of the Institute. Many of you, of course, know him, and he's just fantastic. One of the things that was really important to me when I was thinking about which academic institution to work with is to find someone in academia who actually understood the real problems of cyber. Too many of them live in a bubble, as you know, that are working on research that has zero relevance to the real world. And Thomas, I'm pleased to say, is not one of those people. Everything he does is rooted in what's going on out there with the intel services, with the governments. His books have been terrific. So very excited about that. So what are we doing with the Institute? The goal is really to build the next generation of cyber policy professionals. So to that end, we have a three-prong approach. We will have a master's program in cybersecurity intelligence and strategic studies that is launching next fall, but the deadline for applications is actually December 15th. So for anyone that's interested in attending, get your applications ready in the next couple of months. There is a PhD program, which is also critically important to make sure that this is sustainable over hopefully many decades to come, and you know, long past the time when Thomas and other professors retire, we have a new cadre of folks that can come in and teach students. So that's why the PhD program is very important, accepting applications now as well. And then we'll be launching next year an executive education program, which will be a compressed, you know, week-long course for senior leaders from the private sector, senior leaders from government, military officials, and the like, to go in and get, you know, an 8-day or so course on everything they need to know about cyber to do their jobs. So that's
so
really
that's just like a very long-term vision. But, you know, knowing you and your energy, I assume there's short-term plans as well.
There are. So we are going to do, of course, events. We're going to do some specific research projects. We've already had a number of companies reach out to us wanting to work with students and research at the Institute. So, I don't want to get ahead of myself and talk about that too much. And Thomas was really driving that. But yes, stay tuned. There'll be more to come. But the other vision is not a long-term vision. I mean, classes start next fall, so we're getting going. It's as fast as you can do things in academia.
That's saying something.
And Jags, by the way, is one of our adjunct professors. So if you want to learn from the best, you got to come to the Alperovitch Institute. And we have a terrific group. John Hallquist, of course, is part of it as well, and many others.
I mean, one of the things that, I've learned from Jags and JD Work and Silas and, a lot of people who've been on these calls is how complicated the world of threat intelligence is. And then also how much of it is broken. And I almost assume part of what you have sort of in mind for some of this policy work is trying to address those gaps, but I could be totally wrong. I don't know if you're bored with threat intelligence.
I don't think it's boring because, I mean, threat intelligence at the end of the day is all about spies, right? When I was recruiting people for CrowdStrike at the very early days and trying to get them from companies like Microsoft and Apple and others where they have big career prospects and lots of equity, the winning line was sort of, do you want to catch spies for a living or do you want to keep building, Microsoft Office? And it was an easy sell.
I mean, I won't speak to the grander vision of the Institute. I think that's up to Dmitri and Thomas, particularly to kind of scope that out. But part of what we've been discussing with how broken threat intelligence is this whole time is the absence of academia, the absence of a talent pipeline, the absence of third-party validators who aren't directly financially motivated within the space. Or at least not motivated by the same incentives. So the idea of having a well-resourced institute with the right folks, hopefully putting together the right kind of approach to educating more folks to come onto the workforce, but also just allowing us to do work that's independent of the private sector, I think is super important. I mean, it's something that, to me, in my infinite naivete about academia, I tried to approach it before by going to different universities and speaking to them and saying, hey, we could put together a curriculum. You guys have the right classes. Why don't we just marry these two departments? Things that are effectively impossible in academia just because of, the way the egos and the structure tends to go. But it's nicer to just say, well, screw that. Let's take the reins with people that actually know what they're doing and let's output something that folks can hopefully be proud of and that's going to make a dent in the space.
But don't you feel like big industry is also sort of a corrupting factor in academics? Like you have, I mean, I generally point to Microsoft because I think they're the best at it, but they have a tendency to, because they provide a lot of the jobs and other things, sometimes it's hard to get away from that sort of.
Well, look at the Cyber Peace Institute. You just described CPI, right? It was, and not to call people out because I know folks at the Cyber Peace Institute and I respect them, but that was Microsoft money putting up a venture that seems to be almost entirely devoted to kind of representing Microsoft interests in a lot of way. And Microsoft isn't necessarily.
I was going to say, because Microsoft doesn't have enough people representing their interests.
Well, they found that way to gag themselves, right? Brad Smith will talk about things and then nobody else can talk about anything. So their participation is somehow very muzzled in the space. And even the CPI, right? I think they take on some responsibilities where they're trying to guide folks. But if you're an arm of a company that has a brittle public profile, you can't exactly take some swings, right? You're not about to alienate folks, whether it's at the EU or the UN or wherever, making big, bold statements. And I think that's what we need. We need folks that are willing to say, things the way that they are.
Well, I definitely agree with that. Because if nothing else in threat intelligence, we see tradecraft itself has been fundamentally corrupted by the taint of marketing. And again, we understand marketing is required to drive a lot of the investment for some firms to make that intelligence a thing that firm will pursue. But it's a delicate balance. The underlying tradecraft still has to be pure. It has to be correct. It has to be applied in the right way for the right consumer outcomes. Otherwise, you're just slipping down towards journalism or sensationalism or some other, glossy fabric.
I mean, would you say some of our policy is essentially journalism? Like sometimes we do policy for the press release as opposed to because it's effective policy.
I mean, this is the great political science debate over optics versus policy, right? And
are you transitioning to the REvil
I
discussion?
am. You noticed. I did. I was about to ask Dmitri what he thought of REvil. I just wanted to open the door and just be like, REvil, good, bad, ugly.
It's the best guys, right?
Well, I was thinking more like
guys,
the operation against them. Long-term effective, short-term effective.
Right. So like we've had this like long ongoing discussion about whether operations against ransomware operators are a good idea or not. And Dave's position is very much like, should we take people off SVR and put them on like Stanislav, Ivanovich, and try and track down a 24-year-old somewhere in Siberia versus, not doing that. And yeah, like finally something has actually happened.
The color of the op is different, right? You're not talking about tracking Stanislav whatever in Siberia. You're talking about messing with their infrastructure, undercutting their gains. Sorry, I cut Dmitri off before he could answer, but
no. So I'm not very pleased with the media coverage on this because I think it's a little bit overblown. This wasn't, as far as we can tell, a disruptive operation. It could have ended up being a disruptive operation, but this was an intel collection operation where they were in their systems. They were trying to deobfuscate Tor by messing with the Tor RC file. And the adversary noticed that and decided to voluntarily shut things down, right? So, a win in the end, but it was kind of an operation that probably...
What I'm getting from that is that REvil is actually more on the ball than the US government, because the US government didn't know that they got hacked via SolarWinds for months and months and months. And REvil figured out in like 5 weeks that they were backdoored, which is pretty fucking impressive.
Well, we don't know when they got compromised. It could have been compromised for years. So,
well, they relaunched at the beginning of September. So
right,
like the beginning of September until now, and then they discovered they were compromised. So I'm going to give them like the 5 weeks.
Given
they're
like
probably compromised from,
yeah, given the story about the Kaseya key that people may remember that the FBI had to keep, I think that they had been compromised for a while. Then they voluntarily shut things down in July and then restored from backups. And I think the backups were themselves compromised. I'm not sure that there was a second hack.
That is aligned with what I've heard as well, is that it was the initial, they had access from before the like July shutdown and failed to do, like their backup was compromised and they had access from that, which just goes to show how hard IR is.
And that's going to be a bad feeling having your backups compromised like that. Okay.
So I've got a great analogy for this, which is like basically they noticed a turd in the punch bowl and they changed the bowl. Right, like they left everything else the same. They just poured it into a new bowl. Like, okay,
at least it's not one of your
better
prison
now.
Analogies. I got to be honest; those baffle me.
Which reminds me,
I think.
I'll just say this: like, I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago on this, that we should be more aggressive on offensive operations, and the goal necessarily shouldn't be takedowns. It should be causing confusion, getting them to be paranoid. So perhaps better than taking down their systems is modifying the Tor RC file, getting them paranoid that we found out their IP addresses and maybe identified who they are, and getting them to voluntarily shut things down, because that's way more permanent than DDoSing a box or taking a box down and just having them.
That's where I get mixed feelings about the coverage, right? Like, I don't like the coverage either, but that's where we start to get into the god-awful discussion about signaling, right? Like, to what extent are we looking for the medium-term win on REvil versus starting to wave a flag to the 10,000 other ransomware groups saying, well, you know, we are starting to get our hands dirty a little bit. We are going to start doing a little bit more. Again, the coverage, I think it's
Won't they get
unfortunate.
inured to it? Like the more that, like, when they get hacked the first time, it's going to be like freaky and weird. But when they get hacked like the 70th time, it's going to be like, oh, okay, FBI again. Better like shut down the box and spin up a new one. So
just in
that's
this, this sea change in the adversary beginning to react to these things, and this is, of course, where intelligence professionals ought to live, not where the policy actions were or weren't, but what happens next after the policy action is taken, leading to the operational event. When I wrote a paper for War on the Rocks last year, talking about modeling an offensive employment in counter cyber operations on something like JTF Ares, which was at the time the only publicly disclosed unclassified op we could reference in that of that nature. That was not something that was taken very seriously in the policy community before that. It was actually something that offended a lot of people. You know, it was dropping the grenade in the punch bowl this time around. Everyone's sitting there splashed with fruit and trying to figure out what this is actually going to mean in practice. What comes out of that is then a set of folks that believe maybe things are happening, maybe things aren't happening, as various US government folks were making policy statements throughout the year. But now that we're starting to see those operational effects, all of those reactions will start whipping through the system. And again, we can debate whether it's the best use of a capability. We can debate whether the adversary is going to believe that that capability can be applied to them in the discrete fashion versus the broad fashion that some other asshole fucks up. And sorry, I shouldn't be cursing like this, but you know.
You can curse on this channel. I mean, I think there's a lot of really big questions. I mean, the way I see the Alperovitch Institute is finally having the manpower in one place to address some of these questions coherently as they happen, as opposed to scattered throughout the literature. I mean, I'm not a threat intelligence person, so I've spent a lot of time reading like the JD Work paper on the fact that ransomware is a latent threat against us that is always there, that SVR can turn on when they need it to, right? Like, so I don't remember which paper that was, but that was a paper that I was like, oh, you know, that makes more sense to start spending ODA on the problem if it is a strategic threat as opposed to if it's costing money because people don't want to update Exchange. So I don't know.
It's hard for me to think about this from a tactical perspective, right? Like, I'm trying to give some credit on the signaling and the relationship of U.S. government to all this, but to be frank, we are in a terrible position when it comes to ransomware because, I mean, we all know the arguments, right? We all know that it's just simply something that we're not going to be able to really get ahead of. It's more basically collecting technical debt in a sense, which I think is a great way to put it. And it's such a distributed target and attack surface that, like, I mean, who the hell knew about JBS before this? Who really was interacting with Kaseya in any way? I mean, it's like SolarWinds wasn't, at least in my lexicon, before any of this happened. Obviously, that wasn't ransomware, but I'm saying the attack surface is so distributed for us as a developed nation that what we're talking about is the most obvious incarnation of vulnerability. And we were equally vulnerable before, if not more so. It was just harder to argue to people that this was happening and that it mattered because nobody was flashing a red screen in front of their faces, right? Like we had all these hacks, you had backdoors everywhere, you had Zeus everywhere, you have like all this garbage. People still had Configure on their boxes, but it was hard to argue to someone, hey, this is a priority for you, this is happening to you right now, until someone decides like, we're just gonna disable your computer, flash a big red screen and send you a bill. And now we're having these conversations in panic mode, but all it is revealing the true state of vulnerability that we've been in this whole time. So in a sense, we're talking about policy and signaling and trying to deter enemies and control other countries, but the reality is this porous fabric that we're living in that isn't gonna become solid overnight. If anything, we don't know if it's ever going to become solid.
Well,
I mean, part of that, I think,
complaining
also
about security since forever, and now Now that it actually turns out to cost money and be a problem, everyone else is going like, hey, the security thing's kind of important. We should do something about that. And it's a little bit fucking late. Sorry, Silas.
That's the shot to bang problem, right? We are only now hearing the sound of something that has hit us quite a long time back. And policy reacts only on a delayed fashion, even to those events. I mean, we're still talking about Colonial now, despite all the additional highly interesting hits that have happened since the spring.
It's also really interesting to me also, because one of the things that I feel like this continues to show us is that as defenders, we have continued to fail to understand and to have properly enumerated the risks that surround us. And the thing is like, so I come from, at least formally, education-wise, like a sysadmin type background. So like, I'm familiar with SolarWinds. Like, I've used it before. I've set it up many times. Yeah, but like, there's a number of things that I haven't even touched, but I'm seeing also as other vulnerable areas as well. Like, and I mean, like fleet tracking stuff, like that's a disaster waiting to happen. And there's many more of these. And the unfortunate thing is like with like Jags, as you were saying, like, you know, we've had Zeus everywhere for years. Conficker has been everywhere for years. Like, these things have been enumerated, and to well supplied and well supported actors, like having a broader view of the world than the defenders gives them a consistent daily advantage.
Well, it's
So,
something
like one of
that
the things that's interesting about so the Chinese have a doctrine which covers cyber, but they don't call it cyber. They call it like the information domain. And they, like, the way they put it forward is that the more like information domain technology you have, the better connected you are, like the better command and control you can do, and the faster. However, the more you have, the more exposed you are. And it's like, they just put it straightforward as like, they're connected. If you want to be like fast and like do it well, you're going to be vulnerable. Like, that's just how it is.
It's actually the Russian doctrine, and they just stole it like they do everything else.
APT1 publishing doctrine fucking.
all right, if we're accepting that, like the way that you're talking about connectivity as vulnerability, and the way that I've been describing sort of this ransomware collection of technical debt that we're not going to get over anytime soon, then what happens? Should we be talking about our future as one permeated with ransomware as a fact of life?
I mean,
Because that's the thing. Sorry, JD, all I'm saying is like, we keep talking about this as a momentary issue, this momentary panic that will hopefully get behind us and say, wow, you guys remember those terrible years with all the ransomware? And now I'm wondering if it's, you know, what does it mean for us to just accept that ransomware is now another aspect of life, the way we have with spam and credit card
But we haven't.
theft,
But we haven't actually.
carding?
And so this is kind of the thing though. And the thing is we've gone through these cycles. So I really love DDoS because like it's such a short cycle and you can always see it, where like operators go from what like to what works. So the thing is like 1 month, like amplification DDoS is like all the rage because somebody knocked over GitHub. But eventually that stops working, whatever, and then a Mirai comes out and everybody rushes over to like building botnets like to do DDoS, and then it flows back. It's the same thing with like the criminal ecosystem. Like these things stop working and they fall away. The problem is as well is we've hit something that works really well. And so I think we're all expecting it to sort of like fade away, but these things don't fade away. They fade away when they start to decrease in decrease in the return on investment. Like,
right. So like, I mean, what ransomware has done is it has cannibalized all of the other criminal ecosystems. So the people that were developing banking Trojans, the people that were doing a lot of the carding have essentially gone into ransomware for a variety of very understandably lucrative and frictionless reasons, right? If I can get my money without needing money mules, if I don't have to send a bunch of kids over to Walgreens to test my credit cards, obviously it's much nicer to just do the ransomware thing. But I think it's easy for us to forget, you know, living on the forefront of InfoSec, it's easy to forget that the back of the bus of InfoSec is still very much there. Spam lives, credit card theft lives, carding lives, banking Trojans live, all that stuff is still there. It's just not sexy. It's the janitorial aspect of InfoSec that people don't want to deal with. And I guess where I'm trying to kind of force us into a really unpleasant corner is ransomware just that now? Like,
Ransomware is spam, but with money, I guess, is what you're getting at. And I think that's not far off. So like some of the things that come up is essentially the only person that has a say in Russia's involvement with ransomware is Putin. Like it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks, what anyone else sort of tries to do, until he decides to stop it, it's going to stay there. But the issue that comes up is how come only Russia is dominating the space? Like there's huge amounts of money to be made. There was like 5 billion that got shipped to ransomware addresses since 2019. Like you'd think that North Korea would be all over that, but somehow they're not. Like why don't we see as much activity from like the other states?
Let's piece that apart a little bit. I share your interest, I share the question, but let's piece apart what we're talking about with ransomware, because it's not like there aren't kids down the block running certain ransomware ops. What we're talking about is targeted enterprise ransomware, the kind of stuff that like you go in, you steal a bunch of data, you lurk for 3 months, you expand to the whole network, and then you deploy your ransomware. That's more of like, APT style ops, the way we talked about Carnvet Act in 2015.
It's a business process, though. It's just a business process for these guys. Like if you look at it, what happens is the guys that run the ransomware groups, they essentially just manage assets, resources, and money and branding, right? Like, so the affiliates are the ones that do all of this stuff, and it's up to them sort of how sophisticated they want to be. Like, as long as they don't interfere with the brand and they bring money in, the guys who run the actual groups don't care. And I think, in a way, that's one of the things that makes ransomware a difficult problem, is that even if you take out REvil, like REvil is basically a few servers and a guy with a Bitcoin address and, a really big Jabber contacts list. And that's it. You get rid of him and all of the human infrastructure that made that work is still there. You just need a new person on top. And given the money that's available, someone is bound to step up. So
telling you who's stepping up next.
We've seen different players step up in very different ways, though. When we see the Iranian ops, the fundraising is largely secondary to some of the other things that are playing out there. DPRK was pursuing ransomware. I mean, this led to the infamous terrible misfire of WannaCry. It found that cryptocurrency exchanges were far more lucrative given the talent that they could apply to the target space. And when you look at the arrangements for fundraising there, I mean, it is effectively a criminal organization masquerading as a country. But
well, it's true. You bring together like a concept, essentially, right? The criminal organizations have a return on investment, and so do we. And ODE costs money, and trained operators cost money. And so this is my next question for Dmitri, which is it worth it? Is it worth the coin to go after ransomware operators?
It is, but it can't be the only thing, right? This has to be multi-pronged strategy. If you look at my writings over the summer, I really pushed the administration to get serious with Russia, because I do think that Putin fundamentally does not care about ransomware. He doesn't care about these people. If he thought it was helpful to them, he'd sell them down the river. And it's not even clear to me that we should even ask for that. All he has to do is just send them a message, cut it off. But clearly we have not made it in his interest yet to do so, because the threat of retaliation from us is frankly not serious today. That's part of the answer. It's not going to solve the entire problem, as we've just discussed. Even if Russia turns everything off, there's still other operators out there. So it's important to go after them with law enforcement action, with cyber offensive action. And most critically, it's important to go after the cryptocurrency ecosystem. We have to make it really, really difficult to convert crypto into fiat currency if you're a criminal. And I think that is doable if you get lots of nations on board, if we use sanction authority to cut off these exchanges from the global financial system, and just make it very, very difficult for them to profit from this activity.
I wish I could believe that, but DPRK is one of the most heavily sanctioned regimes on the planet, and they're still managing to move that cryptocurrency back into something that allows them to buy ballistic missiles and other things. I'm a little cynical that the ecosystem piece is fixable in any real way.
I think you're right that it's going to be hard to stop someone like a DPRK. I think it's going to be a lot easier to stop criminal organizations that don't have the resources of the state to do money laundering. DPRK does a lot of stuff in arms dealings and drug trafficking and all kinds of other things that would be difficult to do for these ransomware operators.
I agree with Dmitri on that
operators.
Sorry, just to bring in kind of the cryptocurrency element of this, right? Like we're skirting around the fact that like KYC, know your customer, is a big part of what's trying to be pushed on cryptocurrency exchanges, and obviously all the legit ones in the US have to. And eventually you get into a situation where my understanding as I get a little more into the whole like massive cryptocurrency market and try to understand how people are triaging things across different countries, is that that's expanding, right? KYC is becoming a requirement in a lot of ways in a lot of places. It is a really complex ecosystem, right? I could go and turn my Ethereum to Monero and my Monero to whatever, and then to another currency and bring it back. And that's hard. But for once, I feel we're talking about a space where the incentives for the most part are aligned, like the institutional currency that's going into cryptocurrency actually does want to get legit. They actually do want the exchanges to fall under, law and be regulated and everywhere, right? If they're enjoying the different prices of Bitcoin in South Korea versus America and using that to make a buck, I'm sure that they want regulations to still fit into their ability to move their money in and out of it, right?
Well, and it's not an accident that there's less than half a dozen of exchanges that are used by these criminal groups almost exclusively, right? Because they're so easy to use, to convert into fiat currency, which, by the way, they still need, right? I mean, there's only so much you can do with Bitcoin, or certainly you can't do pretty much anything with Monero. So you want to buy a Ferrari, not going to happen with Bitcoin. You want to go to Tahiti, same thing. So you need dollars.
That's a bad idea.
I will have you know, sir, that there is a farm stand down the road from me that sells sheepskin, like wool socks in exchange for Bitcoin. So I may not be able to buy a Ferrari yet.
Dmitri, didn't you buy your pet giraffe with your Monero?
But actually, look at these privacy coins like Monero, right? Most exchanges are starting to ban them because of privacy pressure. So there's a reason why, even though ransomware actors would prefer to get payments in Monero, they virtually can't get anyone to do so because it's so hard for people to procure Monero and to use it for ransom payments.
Let's talk about that. Like the waves of, on cryptocurrency, right? Like that's a developing space that we're talking about it as if, not us in particular, but folks are talking about it as if it's a very solidified fact of life. And I'm not saying cryptocurrency is going anywhere, but it is changing in these rapid iterations and in ways that are not simple, right? Like Ethereum is starting to take over. You have these momentary altcoins built on top of Ethereum. There's so many ways that the space is in a middle stage of maturation. And I'm wondering, like, does the maturation of cryptocurrency eventually save us? Like, is that what we can rely on as an eventual fix to our ransomware epidemic?
Unfortunately, maturation of financial ecosystems for AML didn't save us from cocaine money buying buildings that collapse in Miami, right? I don't know that we get systemic.
Why would you call us out like that? Why would you do that?
I mean, come on, you have one building collapse and suddenly it's, cocaine money is bad.
Jeez. Well, I wish it were only one. But honestly, I mean, that's what we're talking about, like systemic corruption and what cocaine money does to a local government and to inspectors and whatnot, which we can, if we want to stretch that metaphor, we can talk about auditing and compliance and what happens with places that, know they just have to tick a couple of boxes and yet they're still, vulnerable to RDP takeover of a Windows facing server, right?
So like, here's the thing about like, if the crypto financial market moves a lot closer to the actual like banking market as it exists right now, the US shifts into a very, very powerful position, right? Like the US has basically used only a couple of things to completely destroy Huawei as a company, right? One of them is on the financial side where people are not allowed to like buy shit from them. The other is like shutting down their access to chips, which they could fix by taking over Taiwan. And like the third one is sort of like putting pressure on people not to buy from them, which is not very effective because they're a lot of the time they're the only market, like they're the only game in town. So there's not a lot of alternatives. But like they have absolutely fucking destroyed Huawei just from going on like, hey, you can't give them money. If you give them money, like you can't deal with us.
Actually, that's not how they destroyed Huawei. They destroyed Huawei by saying Huawei can't purchase chips from anybody. And the most important chip provider is TSMC in Taiwan. They're the chip provider that Intel uses when they want to build their most advanced chips, which makes it almost inevitable that the Chinese, looking at a strategic bubble right outside their borders, is going to try to do something to take control of it. And the question I think that I was asking JD and Silas and a few other people was, do we have enough escalation dominance in cyberspace to keep the Chinese from deterring us if they decide to take Taiwan? So I wanted to ask Dmitri if he has an opinion that he's willing to share.
So first of all, deterrence in cyberspace is nonsensical. There's just deterrence, right? Cyberspace is a part of geopolitics, and you have to look at all elements of deterrence to figure out if it's going to be effective. I think chips actually have a huge role in deterring a potential Chinese invasion because they're so dependent on both Taiwanese fabs, but also US fabs and fabs in South Korea and other places. So if you can actually convince them that in case of invasion, they'll be cut off, or the fabs in Taiwan will get destroyed in the course of the invasion, that may actually have an effect. But you have to look at other elements of pressure they can apply. And I'm not even talking about cyber, I'm talking about things like rare earths. You're not going to run any fabs anywhere if you can't get rare earth minerals. You're not going to have batteries. You're not going to have lots of other things. And China right now is the producer of most rare earths. Not that rare earths are rare. They actually exist in lots of places, but they're subsidizing the industry and have driven everyone out of the market. It's also a very, very dirty production process, radioactive actually. And no one wants to do it in their backyard. So it's a huge, huge problem. So they do have leverage over us. We have leverage right now over them in chips. So we have to think about both in terms of a deterrence action on Taiwan. And by the way, this is sort of getting away from the cyber discussion, but Taiwan is critically important, not just because it's Taiwan, but if they take Taiwan, they control the Pacific. They're now past the first island chain. Japan is not defensible. Philippines is not defensible. They have just carte blanche in that entire region if they take Taiwan.
I mean, I would hope that Taiwan would be, what makes us spring into action in a variety of ways. I mean, not the way Hong Kong or Crimea went over the past few years. I do find it interesting in this discussion. We're talking about chips, but even the whole discussion about the manufacturing process and the supply chain, to me, it's something that I've tried to bring up multiple times in Glasshouse calls in the past, because I'm disturbed by a different element of what's happening with that control, which is what we're seeing with, let's say, Google and Apple, as far as attribution goes, as far as response to cyber operations goes. The chilling effect is not just a government on government issue. Like, we're talking about these massive, ultra rich transnational companies that rely on, the development of products. And the effects to me are quite, like, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it's quite clearly tied to, let's say, Apple's responses to the Uyghur exploits, and Google's and everybody else who watches this egregious thing sail by and goes, not our battle, not that big a deal, not our problem as Westerners. Like, let's just kind of let that one go because we all like our iPhones.
They're Baidu users, not Google users, so not a big deal.
Well, this is
Right,
the
yeah.
this is where the sharp end of weaponized interdependence actually hits us across the face. We have entities that are no longer national and never have been in the corporate environment, but states still want to treat those entities as if they were somehow related to the country in which they're happen to have a piece of their operations. And when we start looking at the ways in which those levers can be pulled for deterrence value, and I do agree deterrence is a single thing with multiple aspects. Deterrence has absolutely failed for stopping the adversaries from doing the things that they would wish to achieve their objectives. It is now being turned on us in a way that just is deeply unpleasant. And it's not a matter of who can dominate the escalation cycle out of these things. It's a matter of who can even generate the political will to contemplate this escalation. I worry quite a bit about inadvertent escalation. I worry that we walk ourselves into a conflict because we didn't intend to be there. But I worry equally that we don't have the will to fight for anything in the global international order anymore. And as a result, authoritarian regimes simply take the table. And there's a lot of reasons why China might not wish to disrupt the status quo at the moment. But there's a point in time where if they feel they'll benefit more from what comes after, it might be worth the short-term dislocative pain to flip that table and take all of the stakes.
Yeah, that game of Risk in a lot of ways looks deeply unpleasant for us right now. I think the slightly more naive view looking at these companies, right? You could look at Google and say, well, Google had the strength or the strength of character to say, well, we're not going to operate in China anymore after Aurora. They don't seem to be in that position anymore, neither in not wanting to operate in China under Sundar, but also not being willing to call China out for any number of egregious hacks and moves. And fine, we're talking about China, and China's complicated on the supply chain side of the house, but what about the UAE? I mean, we recently found out that among all the terrible things that we watched the UAE do over the past couple of years, even a Uyghur concentration camp within the UAE is not something that we're going to call out with our buddies. We're at a point where I think you use the expression of whether we're willing to fight on any part for the established political order. I mean, I thought that was just my pessimism.
Well, after the forever wars, is there any will to fight for anything right now? I mean, have the last 20 years just been like, you know what? Like, we've done Afghanistan, we've done Iraq, let's take a breather for now. Because
I think there's a strain of political thought that says very much that is the world we would like to have. I do not think it's the world we will see into the 20s and 30s.
Well, that's heavy. So
yeah, we're all getting into this pessimistic, yeah.
Yeah. So,
but I mean, there are reasons
tune in for more on
so,
Uyghur death camps and cyber discussions.
Well, I wanted to ask Dmitri another question, right? So, I think we had like a revolution of EDR, right? Like EDR, like Jags works for an EDR company. CrowdStrike is an EDR company. There's a bunch of those, right? So, in a sense, I feel like that revolution, like in the sense that the future is not evenly distributed, happened in rich Western countries. But when I do like a NATO thing in Jordan, and we're like, hey, you guys should just use CrowdStrike like we do, they're like, we can't afford CrowdStrike. Even if we could afford it, they don't support it in our time zone and language, right? So, and I don't know if that's still true, but that's their impression. And if this technology gets democratized and ODAs start getting caught all the time, what does that really change? Like, how does that really change? Like, if everybody's running something at that level of telemetry, what does that change? Like, globally?
So I think that you're way too optimistic on everyone is running it. And, the adoption is still, in terms of market penetration, very, very low. It'll get better over time, but it will take a long, long time. And then it also requires people to actually look at their consoles and do something about it. I can't tell you over the years how many customers I've had where, you send them alerts, you call them, no one's picking up the phone, no one's doing anything about it. that's how most compromise actually happened. It's not because there's no telemetry, it's because no one bothered to look or had people to look. So you're still going to have tremendous successes. I think what has changed, the biggest change that we have seen in the last decade, is that running a long-term campaign and remaining undetected, long-term, I mean multi-year campaign, is, I think, very difficult, if not impossible today. I mean, you look at SolarWinds, the best attempt that we've seen in recent years to do a very stealthy campaign, success rate, what, 9 months, 10 months before it got caught. Compare that to the campaigns that we've seen in the early 2000s from China, like Shady Rat and some of the other things that publicized. Multi-year campaign, 5, 8 years before they, anyone even noticed them, right? So that has changed. The idea that you can do an operation and not get caught over a long period of time, I think is unrealistic now. But you can still have a smash of success.
Does that just translate into more money for like Raytheon and other defense contractors who are providing the tooling for these sorts of things? Because like every time stuff gets
Those aren't
burned,
the people getting caught, right?
Right. Well, they would be if Jordan was running EDR.
If anybody's watching those consoles, right? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Grugq. It's just like, I think
go for it, man.
Well, part of what we're seeing as how folks are adapting to this idea of pervasive EDR, XDR, or whatever in their targets, at least in the Western world, is basically disposable tooling, right? Like even with the Russians now and
Cobalt Strike.
Right, can Cobalt Strike everywhere. And moreover, like if you look at Nobelium, or at least some of the ops that are falling under this giant clusterfuck that is Nobelium, sorry, they're using 7 different loaders for Cobalt Strike. So like they're just writing loaders that they know are going to get burned. And then they load Cobalt Strike, and then you see, is it worth it to stay here? Are we going to get a third stage payload? Well, is there an EDR around? Is there something? Oh, there's nothing? All right, now bring out the kitchen sink. So I feel everybody's just kind of adapting to this new normal of having these things. And it's why you see, for example, Microsoft seems to be primarily the one seeing 3rd and 4th stages, because the assumption is, well, there's no EDR on this box. Yeah, but there's Microsoft, sniffing around on this box.
So given how little Microsoft makes public of what they see at a long time frame, that's actually a very survivable equation for a lot of those operators.
Right.
And they're also kind of biased in what they do release.
Yeah,
like
if anyone saw the Light Basin report that was published this week, I mean, they're also starting to move to systems that don't have EDR on them, like Solaris systems, old Linux systems, old Windows systems, and doing interesting things to stay resident in the network without being on a box that would be heavily monitored.
But we haven't seen innovation in terms of like turning off the EDR that I know about. Like I haven't seen, is that
all the time?
Yeah, it happens.
Okay.
Because the only reports we get are written by EDR companies, they never mention that.
Oh, okay, good.
Nobody.
Come on, man, think about it.
Well, let me put it to you this way: no one wants to break an NDA to tell the world that a customer decided to like turn off 2FA and like leave a panel up, with an email that had a password that was in a breach from 3 years ago. That it's just not a conversation you want to have. But anything that has an off button somewhere in some way is reachable, right? Like you try to do your best to have anti-tampering, to have multiple controls, to have multiple people be involved in that kind of process. But at the end of the day, you can't exactly tell a company, hey, you'll never be able to turn this thing off, because that's just not the way the world works, right?
Well, I have one last annoying question.
I've got one question for Jags, I guess, Dmitri, which is, if these people are writing like essentially a custom loader per month or something like that, just so that they can iterate really rapidly, how do you still do effective clustering? Right? Because clustering, how do you go like, oh, okay, this is all from the same threat actor because they're using the same tooling? Like that ceases to apply. You now have to find some other way.
Talking about ransomware, you're talking about
just cyber operations in general, when you do like a DFIR and they've
Well,
got,
I
Cobalt
actually-
Strike running with the custom loader. How do
Yeah,
you go
I
like,
mean-
this is
Well, you look at other things, right? When you're monitoring everything that happens, including hands-on keyboard activity, that's where a lot of your attribution will be very valuable because they use certain unique techniques, certain unique tools, etc. But I'll tell you this, like I've been concerned about this for a number of years, particularly when it comes to China, but other actors to some degree as well. The challenge that we have is a lot of our initial attribution was developed in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And people kind of continue to carry over those attributions. And I've been of the mind for a number of years now that we need to scrap all that and start over, because there's been a lot of churn in those groups. Like, if you're in one PLA unit, well, first of all, there's been a massive PLA reorg, but maybe you moved to another unit, you brought your tools, your techniques, and now we're attributing a completely new group to the old one because that person has moved. And I think it's a huge issue in the threat intel community right now. We need to scrap all the names and start from scratch. And Rebellion is a perfect example of that.
You beat
Iran
me to
actually
that.
built that as a deliberate process where they're rotating folks specifically to achieve those deception objectives.
But also because it's good practice, right? Like you rotate people around your organization and they cross-train and they make everything better.
Right, and they develop all the personal connections that they need to actually be effective as they go forward, because it's easy to be like, yeah, you need to call like that department. You go like, oh yeah, I know Biff. I'll just give him a call and he can like sort this out,
Well, I'm glad we can all like pat the Chinese and the Russians on the back on their effective
And
management
Iranians.
of like interdepartmental bureaucracy on the basis of cyber ops. We are not being as nimble in response, right? Like to the original question about clustering, and I'm glad Dmitri brought up Novelium. I think it's awesome that organizations like Microsoft have caught on to Novelium and have started to share with us. I am a little bummed out, concerned, whatever, about the sparseness of the logic behind new groupings like Novelium and Hafnium, where we get this kind of call from above where Microsoft and their all-knowing telemetry comes down and says, look, a group. And then we all spend all this time chasing this group, trying to corroborate. They're not necessarily wrong, but when you look at Novelium now, months into it, it's like there's 3, 4, 5 groups operating within this Novelium cluster. And, to Dimitri's point about the Chinese, it's, folks are trying to equate Novelium with APT29. That is not, it's not representative of what we're seeing now, and Novelium isn't representative of what we're seeing now. So we're in this very bizarre space of trying to approximate the shapes behind the shadows on the wall, and we're almost confusing each other a little more than we are helping.
Guys, can I ask you a provocative question? Should we elevate, does it still make sense to track individual groups, or should we just focus on agencies? Like, do we really care which TRB in the PLA is responsible for this? Or should we just say it's PLA, it's MSS, it's SVR, and leave it there? Because there's way too much churn. First of all, there are reorgs that are happening inside these organizations that we don't even have visibility into, people movement, etc. But the mission sets, we broadly understand what PLA is interested in, what SVR is interested in versus GRU. Should we just keep the attribution at that level versus trying to go deep into the subgroups?
And I care because how I break a contractor working for the MSS is different than how I break a TRB in Shenyang.
Well, it goes to speak to JD's visibility, right? And your ability to discuss these things at a country level. To me, it's important to continue to cluster the groups in a slightly more granular fashion, even more granular than what we're doing now. Because we're not good at doing what JD's talking about. Like I'm referring to the private sector and the people on my side of the house. We're great at finding clusters. We're great at, just breaking these operations down. We are not very good at figuring out what the politics, organizations, bureaucracies involved are. And misattribution seems almost second nature for us. So Dmitri, I want your approach to win out. I wish we could consistently have a conversation that says, this is the GRU and that is the GRU and that is not the GRU, that is the SVR, and we could have a cohesive IR conversation about these things, international relations driven conversation about these things. But we
And
suck
for our
at
viewers,
it.
I just want to make it clear, I don't think there's been a single case of a respectable cybersecurity company misattributing at the agency level. I think most of the misattributions have been at the subgroup levels, mostly because most companies have very different groups anyway.
I
but
think
also
you're overloading the term respectable when it comes to.
Well, and I do think there's a lot of initial Quo Vadis that gets it very wrong. I mean, Triton was initially seen very much as an Iran operation, simply based on the idea of this benefit, but not fully formed analysis.
It's tough. I mean, I want what Dmitri's talking about. I like to discuss these things that way, which I'm doing a little more freely, even though perhaps I shouldn't these days. But we're not very good at those groupings. I also wonder to what extent those groupings are becoming more fluid. Like, not to say that the SVR, the GRU, and the FSB are all going to hold hands and do operations together, but what happens as you start to create the same thing as we're creating within our intelligence community, where you start to see these sort of joint organizations, you start to see joint task force, you start to see tooling being developed in orgs that serve multiple of these organizations. I mean, there's ways that we could look at what happened with, what Kaspersky's attributing to Kazuar, Nobelium, Tomaris, where it's like, well, it looks like someone might be developing shared tooling between what we would traditionally think of as two very disparate orgs. Like, how do we handle that, right?
Well, and that's where the contractors come in, to JD's point, right? You may have a contractor that's providing the same tooling to different orgs, and you have to look at hands-on keyboard activities to differentiate.
Guys, we are basically at time, unless folks feel like sticking around, but I think we've taken a lot of Dmitri's time. Maybe in respect to our guest, if there are closing points, arguments, questions, I feel like Dmitri, you should have the last word here.
I just thrilled that I finally got the invite that you guys felt like included in this group. But no, great discussion. This is awesome. So thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure that you come in, and of course it's an open invite. Whenever we have these, you're more than welcome to join us. I think we'd all be thrilled for it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so that's time, and we're going to call it a wrap right there. Thanks for joining us, and we should be back next month with another session, and maybe Dmitri can join us then as well. We'll see. All right.
Take care, guys.